is Unit 2, Part 3 of Cellular Respiration. We've dealt with the 3 parts of cellular respiration: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and ETC. Now we're going to look at what happens if there is no oxygen present. If there's no oxygen present, then we're going to go through this process called fermentation. Here it says ethanol or lactate. What does that mean? Well, fermentation is going to produce those things. So here's the glycolysis payoff phase. This is important for us to see because glycolysis makes NADH. If that NADH cannot go into the electron transport chain because there's no oxygen, remember electron's the final, or oxygen's the final electron acceptor, then that NADH is going to be stuck. It's going to be stuck there with its electrons, unable to let go of them, and eventually it's going to build up, and glycolysis is not going to be able to continue. So the purpose of fermentation then, is to free electron carriers so that glycolysis can continue. It's going to take those electrons away from NADH, making NAD again, so that that NAD can go back in and feed the reaction of glycolysis. Again, we're not talking about Krebs and ETC happening because there's no oxygen. And so what's going on here is even though glycolysis only makes a handful of ATP, it's still enough to sustain the organism at least shortly. Some bigger organisms like ourselves, for instance, we can't do this for very long, but some organisms can actually live this way. And so there are 2 kinds of fermentation. If you're a bacteria or a yeast, that fermentation is called alcohol fermentation. Why is it called that? Well, the major product is alcohol or ethanol. You can see here, this is the simple version of glycolysis. Glucose makes some ATP, makes some NADH, becomes a pyruvate. Again, in order for that to continue, that NADH has to be freed up, turned back to NAD. This process of fermentation does that. Converts this pyruvate into ethanol by ditching a couple of by ditching a CO2 and making alcohol. So what do we use for this? Well, think about baking bread. If you bake bread, you put the yeast in it, you set it on the counter, it raises. Why does it rise? Because the CO2 given off causes the bread to rise. And you're thinking, well, there's alcohol in my bread. Maybe so, until you bake it and the alcohol burns off. But this is how you make beverages like beer and wine and spirits and other. This is how you do that, by causing those yeasts and bacteria to produce alcohol through the process of fermentation, robbing them of oxygen. What do? We do lactic acid fermentation. Same idea, except for the product is lactic acid or lactate. There's no CO2 given off. This pyruvate is just simply converted to lactate, and NADH is freed up to continue glycolysis. Again, this is not a very efficient system, but it is a way to free up those molecules so that glycolysis can continue and allow life to be sustained for a little bit longer. So we've talked about how sugar is broken down. Well, how are things like proteins and fats broken down? Well, here's an amino acid. This is the building block of a protein. Through a process called a deamination, the protein is broken down. Well, there's the amino group, so we're going to deaminate it by cutting off that amino. Look what we have here. Of course, you got this R group. We're not going to worry about that. You have 2 carbons. If you remember from the last video, we put 2 carbons into the Krebs cycle, and those 2 carbons went around the merry-go-round. CO2 was given off, ATP, ATP was made, NADH and FADH2 were made, and so you could feed these 2 carbons here into the Krebs cycle as well, except for you have this buildup of NH2, which will readily grab a proton from the solution and become NH3, which is called ammonia, which is not good for the body. And so the way that our bodies deal with that, our bodies being one example of this, but others also do this, is they take this ammonia and they put it into the bloodstream, and then it goes to the liver, it goes to the kidneys, and is made into a chemical called urea. And that urea is then added to water to make urine, and urine is expelled from the body. And so we break down proteins that produces a toxic chemical called ammonia. Ammonia is converted to urea. We expel urea. Some animals, like fish, they just put the ammonia straight into the water. How do we deal with fat? Well, this should be simple after we talked about proteins. Look what fat is made out of. Just a bunch of carbons. Take those carbons, cut them into chunks, you send them through the Krebs cycle. This is called beta oxidation, a much more complicated process than what we just talked about. However, it is just as simple as taking those two carbon pieces, attaching them to coenzyme A, sticking them in the Krebs cycle, and watching them go. You can also see here while fats contain a lot more concentrated energy than a sugar, a lot more carbons, a lot more energy.